welcome back. The next session is two papers related to standardization.
Okay, and I go till when?
What do we give you? 25 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm excited to present this paper. And let me just start by saying that everything here is going to be happening within some sort of global firm. Think of like a car company like Ford. But you can think of like the core economic mechanisms as things that might apply across firms as well. So the kind of there's no reason that what I'm going to talk about is restricted. Yeah. Okay, so the starting point of this paper is the question of when high-tech industries tend to concentrate in large countries, which is something we hear about a lot today with AI. We've heard about it with electric vehicles, other sectors. I'll try and hold this. Great, yeah, in many sectors, but it's something that people have talked about. So why might this be the case? So it turns out Krugman first formalized this logic back in the 80s. The basic idea is that if I'm in an industry with increasing returns to scale, I want to concentrate production in fewer markets to get that scale. I want to be close to my largest markets to avoid trade costs. And the scale can come either from actual like fixed costs of production or from like learning by doing some sort of a kind of tacit innovation as well. So this is like an old argument. It's come back into style recently. For instance, Mario Draghi, this is like the core argument of his call for what's wrong with Europe's industry is that the scale of individual countries are too small and has to be combined. So what am I going to do today? I'm not going to like generally diagnose this argument. What I'm going to do is tell you about a particular organizational innovation that's happened over the last 30 years within global firms that is going to amplify the scale advantages of large economies relative to smaller ones in some of these industries. So what is this? This is modular product design, which I think I don't have to explain as much to this room as, but let me just kind of give what I mean today. Okay, so here are three different cars / trucks that Volkswagen produces. They look very different sizes, shapes, etc. On the inside, they're much more similar. So Volkswagen, even though they might need cars of different front lengths, 2 or 3 rows, things like that, Volkswagen standardizes the distance between the center of the front wheel and where the driver's foot goes in most of its cars. Why? Because then they can get shared scale economies across their products. In other words, you can put the same engine in there and most of the other components to make the car move as long as that dimension is fixed. It turns out this is like not something specific to Volkswagen. It's common across a lot of complex goods firms. These shared design rules are called design platforms, and they're common for cars. They're especially common for EVs, which I'll talk about. But they don't come from cars. The first modern application was at IBM with their mainframe computers in the 1960s, and they've kind of diffused across a lot of complex goods today. So I can tell you like a business school case for each of these. It's hard to get formalized quantitative data, but my application of the car industry will have some of that. Okay, so why am I talking about modular design? And what does that have to do with production in large countries? So let me just give you the working example, and then the whole paper is trying to formalize it. Okay, so here is one car you may have seen, the Ford Escape. It's been driven in the US since the 90s. It's been built in the US since the 90s. Until 2011, the Ford Escape did not share its design platform, its set of kind of core rules, with really any other Ford product. And so then when Ford needed to produce its core components, including the engine, it made them, so this is like where the car is being built, this is where the engine's being built. It made them nearby where the car is being assembled in Michigan. Why? To save on trade costs. You just want to build the parts near where the final good is being assembled. Ford was building a very similar car, the Ford Kuga, basically the same segments, or roughly the same size, on a different design platform in Spain. And then it got the engines for that car from the UK, which was then nearby. It was at that time in the EU. These 3 rather than 1 symbolizes like the amount of vehicles being produced. Okay, so what happens with modular design, or specifically platform sharing? In 2012, Ford started sharing its platforms across destinations. So what does that mean? That these 2 cars that had to qualify for different end regulations, things like that, started using the same design platform called the Global C. And so Ford concentrated production of the engines in the UK for both markets. Why? To get economies of scale. You want to make the engines in one place where close to the largest market for those engines, essentially the larger assembly plant, which at the time was in Spain. So you go from market for the product to market for the product segment. Then what happens in 2019? We then also get platform sharing across segments. So what does this mean? Ford starts sharing its parts not just between the two compact cars, but with this pickup truck, the Maverick, that starts being built in Mexico. This is a very different shape of car, etc. But they're building a lot of it, and so what does Ford do? They concentrate the engine production for all three of these vehicles in Mexico, again, to get economies of scale, while saving trade costs to the largest market for the engine, which importantly is no longer the largest market for the Ford Escape, nor for the Ford Escape segments. You can get concentration in large markets kind of overall, rather than for types of products. Yeah. Yeah, so literally the same, right, it's built on the same assembly line, and it can go into different things, and I'll talk about why. Yeah. Okay, so what am I doing today? I'm just trying to formalize that idea. So, I'll do so in 4 steps. So first, I'm going to spend a lot of time on measurement, basically collecting product level, so car model level design information on the platforms, and supply chain information covering the universe of the global auto sector. This is kind of the main thing that makes the project possible, is that we can see within the firm at the product level. I'm then to think about like where production will move, I'm gonna write down a model in which these design platforms function as quote unquote input sectors. So what does this mean? It means that if 2 cars are using the same design platform, they can consume the same bundles of inputs, and then countries can specialize in inputs for different platforms in the same way country specializes in a sector. That's gonna help kind of think through the location. Then what am I gonna do? Then to test that model, I'm gonna the core of the paper is these event studies of shared platform adoption, kind of similar to the example I just gave you. For identification, I'm going to use 2 things. One, the fact that the rollouts of new platforms within auto firms are staggered, just because it takes a lot of time to design cars, and there's kind of staggered product cycles. And I'm going to use archives of those design plans to kind of see pre-planned dates of those rollouts happening. And secondly, there are mergers that happened after the Great Recession that basically changed the scope of auto firms. Basically, all the U.S. automakers either integrated with their European affiliates, which were run separately until then, or got acquired. And that's going to change the set of kind of countries that use the same platforms, and therefore it's going to help me get some shocks to platform size, things like that. And then lastly, I'm going to do kind of a quantification at the end, which is going to be kind of a more bells and whistles trade model. The main point of that is to think about how future changes in platform strategy in the auto industry, in particular the rise of these universal EV platforms, change production and the impacts of ongoing tariff policy as well. What am I going to find? So from the model of the event study, so you don't have to believe any fancy quantification for this. So first of all, I talked about the platform sharing across destinations between, like, say, the US and Europe, as I talked about. What is that going to do? That's going to increase input trade. So a car being built in the US is less likely to get inputs from the US, more likely to get them from other countries, and in particular from large markets for that product segment. So what does that mean concretely? So that means that, say, Europe and poor countries, which build a lot of small cars for their local markets, are then going to export the parts for small car segments, while, say, the US will export the parts for very large cars. So you get kind of 2-way trade in different product segments, rather than kind of home production. What happens with platform sharing also across segments, where you get supply chains that look more winner-take-all? What do I mean by that? Rather than production in large markets for the segment, where Europe gets to make the engines for small cars, you're going to get concentration in large markets for the firm overall, say for Ford or GM, because it doesn't matter what segment the car is in, they're all using the same inputs. And so the core mechanism there is the idea that the shared platforms are just expanding the scope of the home market effects I talked about at the beginning. The idea you concentrate in large markets, the definition of a large market is changing. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. And then what am I going to do after those event studies? I'm going to do some counterfactuals just to kind of think about, put names on the countries that are large in different states of the world. Basically, if you go from a no modularity situation to what we see at baseline, which is, let's say, just 2019, pre some of the EV transition stuff. Broadly, who is winning from this is larger countries. I mean, think of Japan, Germany, large assemblers of cars, then are large markets for inputs, and they get a lot of the input production relative to what you would predict. And what happens in the future, I don't know what just happened there. EV design platforms, which are standardized including between the smallest and largest cars, at least according to the automakers, have this effect of concentrating production, in particular in China and the US, while reducing production shares in other countries. Why is this? Basically because China and the US are the two largest assemblers of cars, they're the large markets for inputs, but we also like much bigger cars than the rest of the world. And so as a result, if you allow the big cars being built in China and the US to use the same inputs as everywhere else, then production concentrates in China and the US, something that's basically was not true until very recently. And I'll finally have some comments about kind of the trade war, if we can get to at the end. Basically, there are kind of non-obvious ways in which these platform changes then change the effects of reshoring policies. It can mean that, for instance, a tariff is bad for reshoring for the US, whereas 20 years ago it might have been good. Okay, any clarifying questions before I go through some analyses? No. Okay, 10 minutes done, great. Okay, so just quickly in the literature, I think the main contributions are to this relatively small literature on the design of production functions. In strategy, this is much larger. You know, Carlos Baldwin's work on modularity is there. There's very little in economics. This is the paper being presented right after me, so that's good. And I guess the main point I'm trying to make here is that these kind of within firm design innovations have implications for in space, for trade industrial development, because these are like actually traded inputs. They're not just intangible things like data, etc. Conversely, there's a long literature in trade and development on market size and its importance for industrialization, specialization, things like that. My contribution here is basically to say, well, your market size is not just a function of how many people you have or how rich they are, but also how did your firms design their products, and that's going to change, you know, relative market definitions. Okay, that's the main thing for now. Okay, so measurement. What does this paper rely on? So I'm going to rely on six different data sets that are at the product, so car model by year level. That's going to let me trace changes within a car model over time. The most important of these are these design platforms and redesign dates, which come from several kind of basically automaker kind of industry databases. Let me show you what these look like. So this is the product space of Ford. So these are segments from smallest to largest on the rows. The columns are regions of the world, roughly corresponding to different regulations they have to satisfy. This is that first Ford Escape I gave you an example. Until 2011, it did not share its platform with any other products in anywhere else in the product space. Okay? In 2012, the example I gave you sharing with the European car, you can see it starts sharing with cars that are roughly the same size, the C segment, but in different regions in Europe and China. And then remember I said across segments as well. In 2019, it also started sharing with larger segments, and you can see the pickup truck up there. So this is basically the technological change that's happening. So you can see at the car level. Okay, so let me just now tell you that this is not an isolated example. If I instead take for all destinations, this grid is now basically at destinations or rows and segments, and say, rows and columns, and say, for each destination, what's the probability that a car that's being assembled in this destination shares this platform with at least one other car assembled in the column destination? So off diagonals being filled in means there's platform sharing across this space. You can see that even 20 years ago, there was a fair amount of platform sharing across different regions of the world. 40 years ago, this wasn't the case, but I don't have quantitative data to show you. Across segments, it was somewhat less common. So this is basically showing you that there was not that much platform sharing across between smaller and larger cars, or thinking of different qualities 20 years ago. If I go forward to the present, spoiler, the left panel is not going to change much, but take a look at the right. You can see it being filled in much more. And so why is that happening? It's basically, it's becoming easier for various technological reasons to share platforms across between smaller and larger cars. A big part of this is the electrification, not necessarily of power, but just when everything has a chip in it, you can code the same physical, say, engine or other component to do slightly different things for your different products. And that's something that wasn't, say, feasible in the 90s. Okay, now let me, just as a quick thing, so apparently the EV makers say that this is their platform strategy, at least so BYD actually has one platform per generation for everything. GM claimed 3 years ago they were going to copy. They've walked a lot of that back since, but this is kind of what the industry claimed it was going to do. Okay. Okay, so there's that. Then what I want to do is just verify quickly that like parts are actually getting shared when these names in a spreadsheet start becoming the same across cars over time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a separate data set from the Hollander interchange, which is this old database that junkyards use to track interchangeability so they can resell parts in the US. It's very nice that they have this because the automakers themselves like to hide this information. If you have a premium car, never go to the dealer to buy parts. Okay, so what happens here? So if I just take two cars that used to be on different platforms and get redesigned in the next generation to use the same platform, what happens to their parts overlap? The share from 0 to 1. So okay, so for the body, which is the outside, and the interior, which is the stuff you as the consumer see, there's very, very little change. For the stuff that the consumer does not see, the engines, the drivetrain, chassis, and electrical, which together comprise about 80% of value added, there are large increases. So you can think of it as we're keeping the customization for the consumer to the extent possible, while standardizing the increasing return stuff on the inside. Yeah, 10 minutes? Great, okay. Okay, so let me kind of skip through the rest of the data for time. Let me quickly talk through the model and quickly talk through the core event study tests. So what is the mechanism? So why do I need the model? First of all, to just understand where production is going to concentrate, because intuitively you can see production will concentrate somewhere, but we need a way to think about which countries. And two, in order to test that, well, okay, platforms are like moving objects or changing through states of the world. So I can't really like take a platform, look at a pre-post. What I need is to hold a product like a car fixed and look at how its sourcing decision is going to change as I change its platform. And so the model will give us those predictions. Okay, so what is the structure of that going to be? So think of there just being two countries, a bunch of non-traded products. These are like final cars that are assembled and sold and you don't have trade in the final cars. They're all like American cars built in America for America. The product demand is going to have three different layers, and the best way to see it is actually just to see what the function for demand for a particular car J looks like. It's a function of how much expenditure is there on cars in a country. So this gamma is like how big is your country. Preferences for a particular segment. So this beta SD is how much does America like large cars relative to smaller ones. And then your prices, which you set, and the prices of your competitors, which you take as exogenous. But these two, the gammas and the betas, are the important things for now. Okay? Given this, what is a firm going to do? They're going to have this exogenous partition. What does a partition mean? It's I'm going to take all my products, and I'm going to divide them into some number of platforms, so some number of groups as indexed by G. And then what happened? That's kind of handed down by my managers once every 10 years. Given that, what is my sourcing decision going to be? Well, I know that for within a given group or partition, I have the choice to produce inputs in either location. To smooth things out, it's going to be there's like at least epsilon will be produced in both locations. What's the key feature here? The production is going to have economies of scale. So this is just a way of having economies of scale that's log linear with elasticity eta. So you can think of the shadow marginal cost of producing inputs for a platform in a particular location are falling with the amount produced. So it's kind of standard log linear scale economies. That combined with the fact that it's going to cost symmetric trade costs to ship those inputs to final destinations, or ship that engine that I produce with scale economies to my assembly plant. These two things together are going to give me some market size effects. And basically then these are just combined into the inputs for the product. Okay, so why set it up this way? Well, it's going to give me this idea that I told you, which is that for any platform, relative production costs are going to fall in relative demand for the platform's inputs. But relative demand for the platform's inputs are themselves just the sum of demands for the products, which are going to depend on how big my country is and whether it likes that particular product relative to everything the other country for everything else in the platform. So it's kind of the idea that like it's classic mechanism, but you can change the scope depending on the summations. Okay, what does that mean for where production actually goes? I'll give you two examples, and I'm going to show you event studies of these in a bit. So let's start with no platform sharing. We go to platform sharing across destinations, say US and Europe. What should happen? I'm building the car in the US. I should see increased import shares. So I'm going to buy less from the US, more from other countries. And in particular, if those other countries are large markets for my segment, they want a lot of that engine. Why? Because they want a lot of engine, they then want to, it's more profitable to concentrate production there rather than near me. And then what happens when we have platform sharing across not just destinations, like between all the small cars in the world, but also between the smaller and larger cars? Then what you get is substitution away from countries that prefer that segment. In other words, if the small and large cars in the world are using the same parts, cool, then I'm going to actually source less of my parts of small cars from places like Europe and India that prefer small cars, and more from places like China and the US that just build lots of cars. So in other words, what I've just told you is, first, countries' preferences start to matter because we're specializing in segments, and then they stop mattering. That's basically what I tell you. Okay. So in the last 5 minutes, let me show you how I test these things. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to hold fixed a particular product and ask, what happens to a sourcing decision when I go from not sharing my parts, the green box symbolizes what I'm sharing with, not sharing my parts with other countries, to sharing with other countries. How will we do this? Okay, so in levels, it's pretty clear that cars that use the same platforms are going to be technologically similar, so that it's all endogenous. Sometimes people use this for measurement, but I want to kind of control for that. So instead, I'm going to use a difference in difference, exploiting the fact that we redesign the same car over time, roughly every 5 to 10 years, and that's going to lead to adoption. Because the timing of that adoption could be endogenous to all sorts of strategic firm changes, I'm going to use the fact, what these histograms tell you is basically that I see the plan several years, anywhere from 1 to 8 years before the actual adoption, and so I'm going to use the plan dates, because basically the firms are announcing this years in advance. And then there's a variety of other checks basically about placebos of when those plans are not implemented, does anything happen? Okay, so so this is going to be a standard difference in difference. The first regression is just the import share is the outcome. So when I start sharing a platform with other countries, do I start buying parts from other countries? And so what do I find? That is indeed the case. So about a 10 or 11 percentage point change. That is roughly about 30% of the kind of post-NAFTA rise in import shares for US cars, so it's pretty important in magnitude. And it's just coming from technology, not from any sort of policy change. Doesn't happen for other events that are not these local to global redesigns. So it's really just increase in trade coming from this type of effect. And then this is some placebo checks, basically using the planned dates as the middle panel there. And then you might ask, I've been talking about this as market size is a thing that matters. Is it actually the case that sourcing shifts disproportionately to countries that are now the largest markets for my inputs? So what I'm going to do here, what this regression basically says is I'm going to take the event study where I take a car and redesign it, and I'm going to interact the time since the event with how much more is being demanded in each country due to the event. That's going to give me a change in platform market size. Yeah, 2 minutes, cool. And I could either just look at the observed change in platforms, or I could look at changes that are exogenous, which is what I'm going to do. And so where I'm going to get the changes from the fact that there were these mergers between all the US and foreign automakers around 2008, not for reasons of getting future synergies 15 years down the road. It was due to the fact that they wanted to save capital costs in the short term. But that's going to give me changes in which cars abroad are now using the same inputs as me. And what do I find is that what this basically shows you is that when, as predicted by the merger, I actually start, there's a lot more cars in another country that start using my same inputs, I'm much more likely to buy my inputs from those countries. In other words, like these market size effects exist at the country level. Okay, I have a minute left, so let me kind of show you a little bit of counterfactuals. So like, what is the point of all this? To tell you that basically the scope, like a country's market size advantage in a high-tech product, these car inputs, depends on these platform scope decisions. Okay, now let me show you, just like feeding into a quantitative model, excuse me, these realistic effects. So now I'm just going to take cross-section data from the world, a trade model where I'm kind of backing out countries' productivities, etc. And I'm just going to say, okay, let me feed in the, let me skip through the data requirements for now. This is basically standard kind of spatial model stuff that assumes basically that one cross-section of the world that you see is the true world, and I can back out productivities and things like that from that. I'm just going to go from no modularity to what I see today, and from today to the EV world, and ask, which countries are winning and losing? And so what do I see? So if you just start from nothing and you go to, you start sharing across the countries, this is the change in input production shares by country. You see a lot of small countries are winning. Why is this? Just sharing platforms across countries still lets a lot of smaller countries do okay, like South Africa. Why? Because a small country can still be a very big market for something fairly specific. Like South Africa builds lots of these like very cheap pickup trucks, and so it gets to be a market for that. When I also start sharing across segments, you'll notice two things. One, there are way more dots below the line. I'll finish up 30 seconds. Way more dots below the line, only a few above. These are relatively large countries that are winning. Why is this? Because these guys, like France, Germany, Korea, they build lots of different product segments. So they're large markets when you start combining across segments, and so production shifts there and away from countries that have very relatively niche preferences. And then what happens in the future with EVs, this is the CEO of Ford announcing this, that they're going to go to universal EV platforms. I didn't doctor that photo. Basically, there are two countries at the top right. Those are China and the US. Mexico and Germany are the only other countries that have increases in production shares. Everybody else loses, and often by very large shares. Why? Because once you allow the largest cars in the world to start sharing the same parts as the smaller ones, basically production shifts to a few, like one or two countries per firm, and that's usually the US, China, and in some cases Germany. Okay, so let me kind of pause there, but basically a takeaway you should see is that the kind of within firm tech changes I just showed you about could lead to patterns like this in the future. Okay, thanks. That's it for now. Yeah. Okay, actually here, just take the mic.
Okay. There we go. Sorry. Oh, this is not PDF. How do I do full screen? Wait, what's the full screen shortcut for this?
Where is full screen?
The three dots on the right.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. There we go. Perfect. Okay, there we go. Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers for putting us on the program. This is fantastic for me, especially because I'm not an IP guy. I'm not even really an innovation guy or a particularly innovative guy. I'm a macroeconomist who studies, among other things, firm dynamics and the structure of firms in the economy. So that's kind of where I'm coming at this. And this paper is very much in this thing. There is a connection to innovation, so they didn't completely mess it up. But I'll try to kind of get to that towards the end of my talk. Right? So conceptually, what this paper is about is thinking about returns to scale. Right? And then the connection to standardization will become obvious here. And I want to kind of emphasize the concept here because I think that's important. When I say returns to scale, what I have in mind is what happens to the marginal cost of a firm as scale expands. This is different from what we teach, in basic micro. When we talk about returns to scale, we're often thinking about what happens to average costs. If you think about the standard notion of average cost being greater or lower than marginal cost, that is what is happening to average cost as we expand scale. This is a slightly different concept, and you can cook up examples where one is true and the other isn't, and without too much difficulty. And I want to emphasize that this is the object that it depends on the question you're interested in, and this is the object that often plays a big role in many macro models. And one of the reasons why it plays a really big role is this is what determines how a firm responds to a change in the external environment. So the classic example we're going to do is suppose demand expands. So suppose demand for your industry expands. You have to decide how much production to expand. If you're riding up a very steep marginal cost curve, you're not going to expand a whole lot. Right? Whereas if your marginal cost curve is very flat or, like in your case, declining, then you're going to expand a lot. And that's a sense in which this object is really key for understanding what happens to a firm or what happens to an industry when conditions change. Right? So what the paper does is essentially to kind of investigate one particular driver of this returns to scale, and that's standardization, right? And that's essentially the extent to which multiple units of a multi-unit firm share attributes, right? So multi-product, our empirical application will be multiple products, but you can think about the same idea in other contexts, right? I'm going to present some theory, and then we're going to push ourselves on the measurement and try and confront the predictions of the theory with the data, right? And that's going to be the game plan. So I usually walk through this example in some detail, but let me just give you the high-level kind of idea behind this example. So if you think about Starbucks as being the most standardized or scalable entity, and Rojo's Roastery is a small chain which has a few locations as being the less scalable of that. And the kind of the central hypothesis is that when Starbucks, by virtue of being more standardized, has higher returns to scale in the earlier sense. So if coffee becomes more popular, Starbucks is in a better position to expand than that one. That's kind of the bite of the theory, and I'll come back to this as we go along. Right? So I'm going to start with a fairly canonical model of firm size, at least in the macro I/O tradition. And then I'm going to, this mechanism of how the firms in the model are going to choose the scope, the number of units they offer, the extent to which they are similar, are all going to be endogenous choices. And that choice I'm going to talk about a little bit in some detail. So in some sense, that returns to scale I'm going to talk about, or that I emphasized in my introduction, is going to be both heterogeneous across firms and endogenous. It's going to be something that's the result of firm choices, right? And then I'm going to test these implications with data on multi-product firms. And one of the things we're going to do in the process of doing that, I'm going to propose a way to measure the degree of standardization, right? At least with the data that we have, and using product attributes, and then we'll go from there. Right? And that's going to be kind of theoretically founded, but hopefully has value beyond that as well. Right? So let me kind of go through the structure of the model really quickly. I want to get to the kind of the key implications, which you can understand with only a few of these things. Right? So think about a firm as offering a portfolio of products to its customers. Those products have the demand system is going to be fairly standard, kind of constant elasticity of substitution structure. I'll talk a little bit about that maybe in the Q&A. The way the firm's products kind of enter or affect demand has an exogenous component, AI, that's common to every product in the firm, and an endogenous component, Z. Right? So the Z is the component that the firm endogenously invests and develops. A is something the firm is, in the sense, born with or fixed in this thing. Right? So Z has two inputs, X, which is the investment the firm makes in something that applies to all its products, and Y is the component that is product specific. Right? So in the paper, which for the interest of time I'm skipping, we have like a micro foundation where think about a firm. The example I'd like to give is think about Tumi and luggage, and different types of bags, right? So it makes different types of bags. It can try to develop a color which it can apply to its entire portfolio of luggage, black or some particular type of particularly appealing black. It investigates what types of blacks work, and then that's there. But it might also make certain types of colors which are uniquely suited to a particular product. I don't know, call it Hello Kitty pink. And that's useful for certain types of products and not others, right? So that's the choice that X and Y kind of capture. There are some investments which can be used for the entire product portfolio, some investments which are targeted at specific products, right? And the ratio of one to the other is kind of a natural way to measure the extent to which the firm's products are similar versus otherwise. Right? This micro foundation also gives us a really nice way to measure that X relative to Y. If I gave you the portfolio of a firm's products with detailed information on their characteristics, all I need to do is to count how many characteristics are shared and how many are unique to a particular product. So if I take Tumi's luggage portfolio, or product portfolio, and I see black, 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 that kind of tells me, yeah, Tumi's invested a lot in black. And whereas if I see a lot of unique values filling those fields, I conclude the opposite. Right? So that's kind of the idea behind the theory and the measurement. The production side, otherwise, there's nothing else. The only reason I flag here is the only substantive assumption we make here is that there's some fixed cost or operating cost that depends on the scope of the firm. NI is how many products you offer. The more products you have some fixed cost, perhaps per product or something like that. Okay? So let me walk through. This is perhaps the only equation, or the only kind of the only math I'll show. Maybe the one more. So this is the problem of a firm. The firm chooses essentially how many products to make and how much to put in X and how much to put in Y. Right? Y is applies to each product. X is something that you invest for the whole product as a whole, for the whole firm's product portfolio. So the firm makes all of those choices. Firms are heterogeneous in this AI. This AI is what makes firms fundamentally different. Some firms are just more productive than others. In my example earlier, Starbucks has some productive efficiency that makes it different, but then it chooses how similar to make its locations or how unique to leave them there, right? So that's kind of the idea behind the model. And then there's some overall limit on what you can invest in, right? So that's kind of what this thing shows here, right? And the two equations here kind of, are the optimality conditions that come from this problem. They look kind of complicated, but they kind of encode what I think of as very simple economics and very kind of fundamentally like relevant part for our discussion, right? The first one says how much X you do relative to Y is kind of intimately tied to the scope of the firm. The more products you have, the more attractive it is for you to make these firm-level investments, right? If you didn't have many products, then you might say, yeah, I might actually, I have less incentive to tilt my investment towards these kind of scalable, these standardization methods, right? Like if you were a coffee shop owner and you only had two locations, it's probably not that strong. If you had 10,000 locations, you have a lot of incentive to invest in X relative to Y. Right? So that's kind of the first part. The second one is perhaps more less obvious, but it's kind of plays actually a more significant role. It says, how do you decide how many products to offer? When you decide how many products to offer, the standard marginal benefit, marginal cost equalization happens, but there's an important component of that marginal, of the cost of a new unit. Right? The first, the left-hand side is just the additional profit you would get from introducing an additional unit. That's the usual term. But now you have one more kind of, it has the cost, it has the additional fixed cost. But more than the additional fixed cost, now you have a cost which reflects the fact that you have to invest a little bit to make each product unique, right? Another way of saying that is the cost of introducing a new product involves investing a little bit in the stuff that makes the product unique, right? And so if you're a firm with a very standardized portfolio, that amount of investment is tiny, right? And so the fact that if you're Starbucks, opening a new location or adding locations is relatively easier, because each location is much closer to the other one. Or in my Toomey example, if you have a bunch of black bags, introducing one more bag is perhaps a bit cheaper in that sense than this. That's going to have important implications, and that's what's going to drive how these two firms respond when demand changes, or different types of firms respond when demand changes, right? Okay, and so this is the key result of the paper. The change in the scope of a firm and the change in the revenues of the firm, the change in the size of the firm when demand changes systematically depends on how scalable the firm is. Right? And the intuition is exactly what I said earlier, which is a firm which has a lot of standardized products, if demand changes, it would expand. It's kind of, in a sense, cheaper for it to expand on the extensive margin. And the fact that it's cheaper on the extensive margin is going to make the firm more elastic or more responsive to demand overall, right? And so that's going to be the central prediction of the theory, which we're going to kind of test in the data, right? So, large firms are going to respond more to shocks. Larger, more precisely scalable firms are more responsive to shocks. It also has this kind of related observation, which is to the extent that it's the largest firms in the economy who are more standardized, or in a sector who are more standardized, an increase in sectoral demand will naturally tend to increase concentration, right? In other words, because those are when demand goes up, it's the largest firms who are, by virtue of being standardized, who are really going to take advantage of that, right? So there's a mechanism to change concentration within an industry as the industry naturally grows. Okay, so that's the main idea. So I want to make one kind of conceptual connection here, and then I want to get to the data. The conceptual connection is all of this object, this mechanism I'm telling you about, in a more abstract theory, is essentially all about that, what I started out in the introduction. It's all about how marginal costs change with scale, right? So C of Q is the marginal cost, so C of Q is the total cost, C prime is the marginal cost. So that complicated object right there is how the elasticity of the marginal cost with respect to production. And if you have that object in any theory, That's what determines what happens to a firm when demand changes, right? Our theory is one in which we systematically relate that object to standardization. But if you write down another model, you can write down a more flexible production function, you might be, you would directly work with that object. But that's kind of, so our contribution here is to highlight that, I mean, I'm sure other people know this. Our job is to our goal is to say standardization is an important determinant of that object. All right, okay, I'll skip the general thing. So we're gonna try and test these predictions in the data. How are we gonna do it? We're gonna work with the Nielsen data. Oh, sorry, let me kind of say one thing. I wanna say, let me just quickly flag what we're gonna test, right? So we're gonna test that firms who are more standardized, more scalable firms, are going to respond more to demand shocks. So we're going to measure scalability, we're going to measure demand shocks, and we're going to see what happens to firms, right? So that's the game plan, right? And then we're going to, some of these are right. The last point here is worth kind of highlighting. In our data, we're going to have the luxury, or we're going to try and come up with a measure, a direct measure of standardization. Obviously, in many data sets, or certainly in many things that are available for other countries or other contexts, it's going to be hard to measure standardization directly. What we do in the last one is to say you could use size as a proxy for standardization. That goes back to this idea of saying larger firms have a greater incentive to invest in standardization. So if you don't have direct measures of standardization, size is perhaps a more easily accessible measure, a proxy for standardization, right? But I think the core of our measurement exercise will focus on the ones where we can measure, but at least this might give us a hope that we can extend this to more broader things. Okay. All right, so let me kind of tell you about the data. So this is the standard Nielsen scanner data, which I'm sure many of you have used. The usual, it covers the CPG sector. The way we're going to think about this, we're going to do this at the sectoral level. Each sector is like a product group that Nielsen classifies products into. The scope of a firm is the number of distinct products. So just to be clear what I mean by a firm, for the purpose of this analysis, a firm is a particular firm in a product category. So GE in light bulbs is a firm. GE in another part of the Nielsen data set is a different firm. So we're not talking about economies of scale or scope across product categories. We're just saying within the product category of light bulbs, how standardization helps or hurts GE or affects GE. Right? So that's going to be the game plan. Right? Now let me talk a little bit about this, about the scale thing, and the shock. Our candidate for a demand shock is the so-called China shock. Right? So that's where we go. Okay. All right. So here's how we measure scalability. Right? So this is just a heuristic, a simple example. I mean, not an actual one. So suppose go back to this GE light bulb example. So we have the product portfolio of GE in that category, and we have detailed attributes. Perfect. So we have detailed attributes. We have a set of attributes for GE for each of those products. Right. So in this example here, there's style and there's use. Right, so there probably there are more in the data for our purposes. The style and use, and the style could be clear, halogen, frost, etc. The use can be night, ceiling fan, blah blah blah. Right. So what's our measure of scalability? Our measure of scalability is if we look at this, there are 2 attributes and 5 products. So 10 boxes that need to be filled. Right. So 10 of these things need to be filled with something. So our measure of scalability is we count how many unique values are used to fill up these 10 boxes, these 10 cells. Right? So there are 10 entries. How many unique values are there? And we divide that by the total number of boxes that need to be filled. So for example, in this example, there are 8 unique values that populate 10 fields. So our measure of scalability is 1 minus that, so it's 0.2. Right? So that's kind of the idea. And this might sound a little bit more mysterious than it needs to, but it's basically very simple. I'm just saying how similar are the attributes across products in this thing. And the only reason we have to do this is because we have multiple attributes and we need to add them up somehow. Right? So that's all. If this was a single attribute, it's trivial. Right? I'm just counting how many unique values are used to fill one attribute. Right? So we construct like a scalability index which is defined like this, right? So a firm which has entirely unique products would have a scalability, every product is unique, every attribute is unique, would have a scalability of 0. And the other extreme, if one value filled everything. Obviously, one value cannot fill everything, so that's this, right? So one of the things so the theory gives us a way to map the scalability index to that x over y, which is the theory object, which is the object in that, but that's just a transformation of this. It's the same object. One thing we do in the paper, which I'll just flag, you might think that this is a this is a crude measure, which might bias us towards finding scalability systematically related to firm size. So we do like a bootstrap procedure to try and clean out, purge those effects from that. All right. So here's what the example looks like. So, kind of passes the smell test. This is GE scalability measure. This is Cataluna's. I've never heard of Cataluna before, but this is another company which makes light bulbs, which is there. So it kind of roughly lines up with what you might think is going on, right? So now we then run a series of regressions on this, right? Let me kind of tell you the punchline rather than walk you through each of these specifications. So the first thing is that we show that scalability or standardization is positively correlated with size, right, in the cross-section, right? And if you look at the cross-section of firms in a sector, the largest firms are systematically more standardized, right? So that's fine. That's kind of, reassuring. But the more challenging one, and that's what's here, is the more demanding test, is that the largest or the firms that are systematically more scalable respond more to the China shock. Right? So if China becomes a threat in a particular market or enters a particular market, that's like the demand for that sector has gone down. You have an entrant with a lower cost who's come in, and our measure of a China shock is constructing a proxy for that. Once you have that, it's the firms who are systematically more scalable or more standardized that change the most in response to that. Right? So that's kind of in a sense, that's the heart of our theory, right? It's saying it's standardization. Yeah, some firms are more standardized than others. Where does that show up? That shows up when a new entrant or a new competitor emerges on the scene. Yeah.
What about cost? Like you also outsource it and the cost will go down?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I think in a sense in this thing we're kind of partly abstracting from you directly buying from them. Right, so that's exactly right. So the right way to think about this is somebody who's a competitor to you on the finished product end, right? And you might argue that China may be an imperfect proxy for that, and we have other exercises where we try to capture that. But that's really what we're trying to capture, a demand side effect. And the China thing perhaps is somewhat contaminated by that, right? But if anything, I would submit that the cost shock thing one might be tempted to think pushes the other way. Like, what are we saying here? So the emergence of China, who gets whacked? It's the large firms who get whacked. That's what our theory says. Like when China enters as a competitor, it's the largest firms that shrink by the most, right? That shrink by the most in terms of their actual sales, right? So if the largest firms were also able to outsource stuff more effectively to China, their sales shouldn't have taken such a big hit, right? So you would have to hear for the cost side to play the role here, you would say, the large guys did not want to outsource to China. The small guys wanted to outsource to China, and as a result of this. Right? And in some sense, that might be true as well. We can come up with a story there. But that's kind of what the idea here is. If we had more data, we could do more on the cost side as well. Okay, this one I'm going to walk through relatively quickly, but it's kind of interesting. The prediction I said that when demand changes at the sectoral level, the fact that the largest firms tend to be more standardized means that our theory predicts that an increase in industry demand increases market concentration, makes an industry more concentrated. So we kind of test that using kind of standard measures of concentration, the HHI, the share of the top 5 firms, the number of firms, et cetera, We do that and we say, does the China shock change concentration, when size and scalability are more strongly correlated? Right, so that's the idea. The more strongly correlated size and standardization are, the bigger is this channel of demand, industry demand shifting concentration. And that's exactly the hypothesis that we're testing, right? And that's kind of another thing which validates to some extent our model. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to kind of connect all of this to innovation, right? So up until now, this had nothing to do with innovation. This is just saying there's some product portfolio. We treated standardization as like an immutable characteristic of the firm, and we just kind of ran a bunch of simple regressions with that. Right? So why is this potentially interesting and has relevance beyond understanding what happens in response to a China shock? So let me show you two results in that respect, and then I'll come back to, I'll kind of conclude. Right? The first one, what we do is we look at what happens when firms introduce new products. Right? And we show that these so-called, and so there's other work in this literature which shows that firms, when they expand their product portfolio, often tend to do them in large bursts. So firms don't grow their product portfolio, a little by little over long periods of time. They tend to maybe hold it resting, and then a big burst changes a whole number of products over time and stuff like that. And that kind of makes sense. It's like a firm figures out something that has a bright idea for something, and then introduces a whole bunch of products using that particular innovation, right? And that's the innovation angle here. What we show is that when firms tend to do that, the new products that are actually introduced do have a significant overlap, right? So there's more standardization amongst those new products when more products are introduced. So, right? In other words, the scalability of the new products is positively correlated with the number of new products or with the revenue of new products that are introduced, right? And that's this idea that when firms innovate, the way they innovate is they're saying, oh, let me try to figure out something that applies to a large number of products, and then I'm going to flood the market with a large number of products. Right? So that's kind of, it says that these bursts are often characterized by standardization to some extent. Right? The last point, which I think is where we come back into this, and it's a nice way to end my talk here because it's really about, in some sense, IP. We show that firms who are more standardized, when they introduce a new attribute or a new characteristic in their product portfolio, they are more likely to diffuse to other firms in the industry. Right? So it kind of opens up this interesting thing, saying as an individual, from my own product portfolio, I'd love to come up with ideas that apply to my whole product portfolio, because then I can really exploit that. What this says is those very things, the things that are very applicable inside your firm, are also the ones that are most likely to be adopted or copied by your competitors. Right? So then you get into this, this is completely absent in the theory, but you can imagine that, as a firm, you face a trade-off of saying, should I make these really high-value investments, which can apply to a lot of my product portfolio, but run the risk of being, copied by my competitors, or should I kind of really focus on making my products unique at the cost of perhaps some efficiency gains? Right? And so that's another kind of direction for future research that this thing opens up. Wonderful. Lots and lots of papers. We stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm happy to talk about many of them. But I do want to flag, in the interest of, again, this is far from prime time for policy, but I think this idea that there are systematic differences in returns to scale kind of, I hope, will push us to think more carefully about what the size distribution of firms means for efficiency and welfare, right? And that's kind of the last thing I want to leave you with. And I'd love to hear what Tim has to say and all of you have to say about this. Thank you once again.
All right. See if I can make this work. So I stood up here at the beginning. Oh, let me get out of that. There. That comes.
You could just hit F5 maybe.
How about that? Aha. Okay. I am stuck in my Apple. Oh, look at that. Okay. So at the very beginning today, I said we've been doing this for 10 years, and you might have thought that after 10 years, I would learn not to assign myself as the discussant to the section where you have to read 175 pages 2 models, both coming from like outside your own literature, giant data collection and assembly effort for each of them. You know, anyways, there's a reason I did it, not that just that I forgot, but that I think, you know, so I find them exciting as a pair. Because they are highly complementary to something that I've been thinking about and working on for like a couple of decades, which is sort of intercompany standardization, right? Like, so here we have 2 papers on intra-company standardization. And so the plan for my discussion is going to be, I'll say a little bit about each paper, you know, a bit of a summary and a few quick comments, not in super great depth, but then reserve a little time at the end to talk about where I think they point us or how they could be used to sort of shed light on this sort of question of intercompany standardization, or maybe just to preview the big thing I'd love to see happen is a direction we could go in to sort of get at this question about when is standardization or modularity delivered by, you know, kind of coalitions of firms versus delivered within a firm, you know, kind of like the Coase question for the supply of interoperability, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to take them in the reverse order, starting with Venki's paper. So here the research question broadly is kind of like, how does standardizing inputs, right? Like this choice, the key choice that you know, kind of they build to in the paper is like, what share of your input mix is shared across products versus product specific? How does that affect scope, the number of products you offer? This is kind of the key equation for the more general version in the paper. And in this equation, you know, sort of there's a demand side, but that's all been kind of like subsumed here, and it's pretty standard stuff where the firm just charges a constant markup because it's constant elasticity. And the key thing in here, there's 2 Z. Z, you can see here, is kind of like a productivity shifter, or, you know, a demand shifter, if you will, for your product that reflects the choice of input mix, like how much of the standardized X stuff and the non-standardized Y stuff. And then there's the cost function. And you can kind of see the scope economies right here in the cost function. Like anytime you use X, you get kind of N worth of Y out of it, right? Where N is the number of products that the firm produces, N is the scope, right? And so the firm is choosing here just this input mix, X versus Y, and the scope. The kind of key restriction on Z, you know, kind of this, that the augmentation term is that it's homogeneous of degree 1, or homogeneous, I should say, of degree 1. And so then this thing, the scalability ratio, really it's just, in one version of the model, it's just how much X. In the other, more general, it's like, what's the ratio of X to Y? That thing becomes like a sufficient statistic for how does the scale and scope of the firm respond to shifts in demand. Pretty clever. Venki related this also to this concept of marginal returns. You know, so that then they boil this all down into a cost function and say really what it's about, and I think you explained this well, was, you know, sort of as output grows, like how much is my marginal cost increasing? That thing then kind of gives you a couple of predictions. And basically the predictions are like, look, as a demand shock, if you have less fast increases in your marginal cost with scale or scope, you'll respond more to a demand shock. So it's kind of like an everything moves together type of prediction, right? Like if you get a sector level demand shock, if you get a firm level demand shock, if your productivity goes up, all of these things kind of, you're going to increase your scope, you're going to sell more, you're going to, you know, like all this stuff varies together. And then the empirical exercise is to take consumer packaged goods type data from Nielsen, which gives you kind of kind of the 2 key pieces you'd like to look at here. You know, kind of you can define a product as basically a barcode or a UPC symbol. And it gives you sort of ways of trying to measure standardization by looking at product characteristics. And they're going to show 2 things with that kind of data. One is that there's just this positive association between the scalability index and firm size or firm scope, and that it sort of the higher scalability ratio sort of amplifies demand shocks, or at least the China shock, right? Like, so firms that get hit harder, they respond more in all these dimensions. thing that I thought was cool and enjoyed about the paper was sort of getting inside the production function a bit using product characteristics, which is something I've thought much more about on the demand side than on the supply side. So that's kind of neat. There's some arbitrage opportunities here. One is that this sort of result of like, everything moves together really reminded me of these old papers like, Susan Athey's early career. She did all this stuff on generalizing to supermodularity. You're running around in like the CES world. You probably could generalize even further using some of that kind of technique. The other one is that I just think there's this cool, there's an analogy. I don't know, it's not precise. It is a loose analogy in my mind, but between your MRTS parameter and what like Glenn Weil and Fabinger study on the demand side, which is, sort of when costs increase, does that pass through to prices? That depends entirely on sort of the elasticity of the slope of the demand curve, just like here you have whether a demand shock passes through to output depends on the slope of the marginal cost curve. You can make all of that more explicit in the paper. I think it's kind of neat. A comment that I have when you get to the empirical stuff is, I just found myself wondering, is that like the theory didn't suggest consumer packaged goods to me. I understand that like, to some extent that's where the data is. We, and in the innovation literature, we look under the lamppost too. But, first I would have loved more examples, like really motivated by, your best example in the paper was IKEA. You talked about IKEA in interesting ways, but I would have loved more examples that were grounded in CPGs. And then, these analogies, right? Like sort of you have to buy this product characteristics are like inputs. Well, maybe, sometimes yeah, sometimes no, I don't know. And UPCs are like products. Again, like sometimes the UPC, it just feels smaller than a product. I reduced by 1 centimeter the dimension on this box or whatever. Other times the UPC does really seem to correspond to a product. So it's a tricky thing. So I'll stipulate to them. I just think they deserve more comment. And then I also feel like in CPGs, like the most natural the most natural sort of scalable input is your brand, right? Like I stole this picture from the Unilever website where they talk about all that. And then those are the modules. They don't ever brand stuff as Unilever, but like within personal care, hygiene, they use Dove. Right, and Dove they put on some of their stuff and not on others, and like that, like a more detailed investigation of where you do the brand sharing seemed like it could pay off, like could bear some fruit. And then one note on the scalability index itself, like I think it can have some weird characteristics, right? Like so, I started thinking about soap because I was making a slide about Unilever. If you imagine you had one kind of soap in 10 sizes, like 10 colors, right? Like that would give you the 0, right? Like there's no scalability because I'm only measuring this one attribute and every product is different on that attribute. Now imagine we just sort of, I'm gonna have 2 sizes, large and small, and I'm gonna cut my colors in half, right? So then scalability has kind of gone up. It's not totally obvious to me, right? Like, because there's now 7 unique characteristics, 5 sizes and 2. Maybe I'm doing it wrong.
I'll come back to this example. I think, I'll come back to this example.
You correct me if I'm wrong. Anyways, I found some weird things. So it just got me thinking, like, there is a whole literature on measures of dispersion, right? And you could try to take an axiomatic approach to this. You could try to rule out, like, it feels like it's subject to some of the, like, IIA properties that people worry a lot about in the, like, demand estimation literature. One kind of way to approach this is to sort of like calculate Herfindahl indices or some measure of dispersion at the characteristic level and then sum those over the products. So also maybe merits exploration. Okay, next paper. Here's the figure I show all my MBAs. It's the supply chain for the iPhone spread out all over the world. How does modularity of the product affect the supply chain? Like this is just first order. We all talk about it and I think there's not enough on it. So kudos. Good topic for a job market paper. I'm going to walk through Vishant's 4 steps really quickly. The first of his step is to get a bunch of data and then generate descriptives. I just want to say I thought the junkyard database was so cool. I love that, partly because I worked at a junkyard at one point in my life. So it's like turning junk into gold. He took the junkyard data and then shows us this very cool new fact, which is that when the platforms get adopted, the auto companies really do a lot of component sharing of the components that aren't sort of visible to the consumer. It's like the engine and the internals of the car seem to be shared a ton when we get this commonality, but they keep the ability to sort of do the styling, right? I think that's neat. It also speaks like it's like kind of X and Y in Venki's model here in a kind of a neat way. Okay, then he builds out a trade model. The kind of key insight here is that so we're going to do sort of the market within which trade happens is the platform, and that generates the results. I think he explained it well. It's going to try to rationalize two things, that there's sort of like this within segment across market, and then sort of we put the whole world into one market, and that sort of undoes some of the effects of the first phase. Then go to the data on trade, right? So different data from the original stuff about the vehicles, and sort of show that the patterns in the trade model kind of bear out. So for instance, when you do local to global redesign, you see this sort of import shares go up. And then when sort of we shift to standardizing, platform sharing across different kinds of cars, then trade moves away from the smaller countries that had previously been producing some of the components that were being traded around the world. And then the last step is to calibrate a counterfactual, which tells us, I'm glad you went out on a limb and made a prediction. All of the EV production is going to happen here in the States and China. You heard it there first. A couple of comments about this. First, it's very cool. Kudos to you for doing the kind of taking a bunch of things that had been written about in, sort of a corner, appreciated corner of the management literature, but not like the most appreciated on modularity, sort of importing that into economics. My caution around the empirics, you've clearly thought a lot about endogeneity issues, but for sure, what products I put into a shared platform is a really endogenous choice for these guys. And you got to be, I think you did a good job of sort of clarifying how you use mergers, or what the assumptions are going to be. Just spell out what they're going to be. A thing that was missing in some sense was, in my mind, was discussion of demand side implications of sharing. So to illustrate that, I'm going to tell you a story about my own car, which is a Honda Ridgeline. This one, the truck. So on the presumably, it shares a platform with the Honda Odyssey, which is a minivan. I'm sure there are some efficiencies generated there. I don't know where any of the inputs are made. That truck I love in Boston, because I love taking my colleagues who live around Boston and Cambridge and drive teeny little cars and showing them my truck, and it plays against type. They're impressed, but they think it's funny and cool. But then I also use it mostly up in Maine, where the modal driver has a F-350 or a huge Dodge Ram type thing. And those people sneer at my truck. Many of them will say something like, that thing's just a minivan, isn't it? It's they know that it's a minivan, and so this sort of how the shared platform, whether people know about the shared platform and how that's received and understood in terms of the design constraints on the demand side, is kind of is something that wasn't in the paper as much. I had really wanted to say more about this, but I have very limited time. Let me say, going back, I would love for these papers to start to be part of a conversation with the literature on inter-firm standardization. I'm going to talk about cosification and the linked IP. Cosification is just asking the question, when are or should standards be made within a firm, like these two papers postulate, and when should it be kind of between firms? I would encourage you to go back and read this paper that's in the Journal of Economic History in 1954 by Thompson about the history of the Society for Automotive Engineers. The story of auto standards was that in the early auto industry, before a car had become a standardized product in general, there was tons of inter-company standardization developed by many companies working in collaboration through the Society of Automotive Engineers, so that you could take the axles produced in one place, connect them to the body produced in another, the wheels, right? All of that was going on. That was the early work of the SAE. When Ford and GM basically sort of the ascendancy of the big three happened, a huge amount of that activity was taken inside the firm. So you got things like the GM standard parts catalog. What was left for the SAE was doing a different kind of standards development work. And we talked a little bit about how this is related to the benefits of being able to experiment in decentralized ways and so forth. But I think what you guys are doing in these papers is sort of articulating some of the costs and benefits of intra-firm standardization that can inform the trade-off that I'm talking about here. So how does it link back to IP? I think a big potential set of costs of standardizing in an inter-firm way relate to control over interfaces and the management of intellectual property in that context. So we heard that this morning when we heard about standard essential patent licensing through pools. Sort of like some of my own work is related to the costs of just the politics of agreeing on standards in an intercompany matter. There's the famous story of IBM giving up control of the architecture of the personal computer and sort of ceding all of the rents to Intel and Microsoft, which sort of is related to like what you own and what you don't own when you take a standard from inside the firm and sort of make it open. There are questions about like the creation of interfaces and the way that aftermarkets emerged. I loved that you said don't ever buy your components from the supplier, but that from the OEM, that is, in the auto industry for a luxury car, and that the OEM is trying to hide the fact that you can go to the junkyard, use the junkyard database, get that part at half the price. Sort of that is an IP question in a sense, and that's kind of where these papers come back to the IP. And then that kind of stuff is, it's relevant to sort of big conversations that are going on around whether we should actually mandate sort of opening of some of this stuff from inside, right? In the big tech context, you have questions about should we enforce interoperability of certain interfaces in digital products that are modular in a sense in their design. So that's how we get back to putting you guys in an IP conference. Thanks very much.
You're going to start responding. I want to pull up. No, you're not wrong. I want to kind of highlight exactly what that made, the 2 points there, which I think I want to just highlight. Why don't you go ahead?
I don't know. Okay. Anyway, no, thank you for those comments. That was really interesting. I agree with all these extensions. A couple quick things. So on the platform adoption being endogenous, this is the motive for having not just the staggered timing, because that doesn't help you with endogeneity of who's on your shared platform, but also having the merger design, and I think the 2008 mergers are probably safer than mergers in general, because other mergers are kind of exactly for this reason. I think like to the extent that even if you think those are selected, the ones that are then shared after a merger, I think that's like a heterogeneous effects question. So if anything, maybe the event studies are like the best case scenario for synergies because they're selecting the events that they based on the potential gains from scale. On the other thing, I think for the demand side implications, I think that's very interesting, and it is funny that you say that, like the guys in Maine know, but others don't. On Reddit, the aficionados know, and nobody else does, and it's not as helpful. I think what's helpful for my context is that because I am interested in the location effects, any kind of change in quality of which you could estimate from BLP, you could do whatever you want for changes in quality of the car from being on a shared platform. It can be in there. It only is a threat to the geography effects I estimate if it changes the relative production costs across countries. So if a lower quality ridgeline or a more Odyssey-like ridgeline, for some reason China happens to have a comparative advantage in relative to the US in the lower quality one, then that's a concern. But otherwise not. But I do agree it's an issue. It's also interesting to think about the demand side implications. Like there's more product variety, all the things that Enki talked about. Like you could think of that as like another block that could be tacked onto paper and it would go full chaos, but like maybe that's a way to get more realistic representation. But yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah. So two very quick thing. You're spot on with this example, but I want to highlight two things which are kind of important, right? So one, in the first case, It depends on if Nielsen, when it gave us a list of attributes, it had both size and colors in there. This denominator would still be 20,
Okay.
right? And this would be 11, right? And that's that one issue, right? So there's a sense in which, but it kind of flags an important risk. Suppose Nielsen looks at a product portfolio and says it's all the sizes are the same. I'm not even going to codify that into an attribute. So there's a measurement error if Nielsen doesn't capture all the relevant attributes of a product, right? So that's one thing this example flags. The second and perhaps related point is one would like to weight size and color differently based on, okay, how different are they from a production standpoint, right? So we don't, at least we have some ideas, maybe we use hedonic weights or something we can try, but really if you're trying to capture how different or how similar are these things on the production side, we don't have data on kind of saying, oh, maybe making things of different colors is trivial on the production side. They're actually all the same thing with a very minor twist, whereas making different sizes is fundamentally kind of a big change on the production side, right? So that's the thing we would really like to do, and we kind of struggle with that. And I also want to kind of take one of your comments about his paper and own it on ours, which is one thing we've kind of punted on, which potentially has important, you mentioned that in kind of passing, which I think is really important. Because we've kind of bought into this constant markup world on the demand side, we're kind of losing the richness of what making your product similar might mean. So you might imagine that if one cost of making your products look very similar is that the customer is kind of saturated with all of that, and you're able to charge lower markups on your whole product portfolio. So that's a different type of trade-off where you say maybe I don't want to make my products similar because it limits the desirability of those products to my customers. So that's something. So thinking a little bit more carefully on the demand side is something I think we, as much as we need to do as well. But I'm happy to take more questions before we. There's a lot I want to tell you, but I think let me take a few more questions and we'll come back. Yeah.
In your model, I guess I was thinking maybe for both of you, but definitely your model.
Yeah.
Whether the partition comes from this vertically integrated firm or comes from a set of standard sorting organizations within the state, it doesn't make a difference, right?
It doesn't, as long, I was kind of agnostic as to it. If it comes from something, public or something that's coordinated across firms, and then
Instead of standard.
yes, and then the sourcing, the key issue is that if you have multiple firms using the same platforms, the same inputs, then that has all sorts of implications for the supplier assembler market structure, and so you could maybe there's less holdup or something like that. So I mean the market structure I assume basically so that I can solve it like a planner's problem is that there's Nash bargaining between an exclusive like the suppliers to a platform are only supplying one firm for that platform, and so that it kind of doesn't matter. But yes, like if you wanted to assume that there's no change in market structure, then upstream, then the standards come. And in fact, actually, interestingly, one interesting case of this is that in China between 2015 and 2020, there was this whitelist policy where basically Chinese government mandated that all the EV makers buy their batteries from BYD or CATL. So in some sense, they had exactly this type of policy. Yeah, but again, that probably had competition implications for all the other EV suppliers, part suppliers, which I'm not modeling out data. Yeah.
Your kind of sense of economies of scale, I think of let's say chips, so specialized in Taiwan. They haven't moved towards demand. They haven't moved really towards the demand. It seems like they're going to stay in Taiwan forever, but for really extreme government intervention and invasion.
Yeah.
Does that fit in your model?
Yeah, so there are two forces that mean that you're in large countries in my model. One is the scale, which is also true for chips. The other is trade costs.
Yeah.
And so that if their trade costs are high relative to, say, the dispersion and productivity across countries, then you're going to concentrate large markets. What really matters is like Taiwan's skill in producing chips relative to other countries, and the trade costs of exporting chips are not so high, then you concentrate it in a place with skill. So I think that's actually a key thing about the car industry is that these things are also kind of heavy, and that's why large markets tend to get them. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if I have a lot to add. So I think it's similar. But I mean, this is similar to the question that came up before. Even in our model, the distinction between, like you could imagine, some inputs started being used because they became cheaper due to some external action, either cheaper or more expensive due to some external action. I think for our purposes, it's okay. All we are saying is that some firms adopt them, other firms don't adopt them. The firms that adopt them systematically are more responsive. So it's we are, in that sense, in a similar thing. Yeah.
Get this one. So related to something Tim asked, and you suggested it too, maybe part of why marginal costs are going to be lower as you expand the scope, I guess if I got the term right, has to do with trademark and marketing.
Yeah.
You know, that the reason everything is the same color, we're building this brand, you know, and people are coming to associate that with us. And so when we want to market this new product, we've got a kind of a head start already in creating goodwill.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that, you know, on that point, I was going to suggest that in our interpretation, the brand or the investments you make in the brand, it was perhaps earlier, I'm almost tempted to think of this as a type of input, right? So like, you know, maybe Coca-Cola says, okay, the key input to soda is the brand. You know, yeah, all the other stuff, the bottle, blah, 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 all of that stuff is there. And so Coca-Cola really invests heavily in a brand and then makes many, many UPCs about that, right? So I'll make two comments about and you also bring up a good point about UPCs and what is the ideal, where do we draw the boundaries of what a product is, right? So I think the conceptually correct way, perhaps the most appealing way, is take a portfolio of products, use demand side characteristics to group them into categories. So maybe from the customer's perspective, all Coke bottles of different sizes are basically the same, right? And then he says, okay, now let's see, does that product, which is this collection of these different sizes, how similar is that to other things in Coke's portfolio, right? Like, you know, maybe all Coke bottles are the same, all Fanta or whatever else it is the same, and all Sprite is the same, and then how do they do that? So we could try to do a better job of classifying products rather than buy into just the UPC as the unit of analysis. And I think the sensible way to do that is from the demand side. Yeah.
Same comment, I'll just give you one example maybe to work with is Burberry. If you buy a Burberry product, you know, what does that plaid look like?
Yeah.
You know, and so you can spread that across coats and scarves and all sorts of different products.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great example. That's exactly right.
That makes me, you know, what you were just saying reminds me of another IO paper. Like, so my colleague Mike Salinger has been really interested in tying strategies, right? Like, so in whether you offer products only as bundles or not, and sort of has a series of papers about product offering complexity and like costs of combinatorial complexity, you know, sort of with very specific, like very targeted antitrust applications. But, you know, sort of it's also fits into this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can imagine another cost of making your products very similar might exactly be that you might, you know, give the consumer like a bewildering array of choices, which may or may not be good. Maybe he likes it, maybe he doesn't.
Okay.
Do we know when we're coming back? Okay. I think we're still running on the 10 minutes behind that I established at the very, very start of the day. So we're just keep looking and just keep doing a right shift if you look at the schedule. So why don't we 4:05 to talk about patent litigation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys.